Hey, this is Jeremy Wallace, Microsoft Certified Azure Solutions Architect Expert and Senior Cloud Infrastructure Engineer for Safari Micro. This is my fourth video in my series for AZ-140 Configuring Operating Microsoft Azure Virtual Desktop. This episode will actually cover two units, service updates for AVD desktops and Azure limitations for Azure Virtual Desktop. So with that said, let's dive right into it. So there are several options for updating Azure Virtual Desktops. Deploying an updated image every month guarantees compliance and state. So what this is saying is, if you recall from previous episodes, Azure Virtual Desktops deals with host pools. Host pools are groups of session hosts. Those are the actual servers, quote unquote, that your users are connecting to get their virtual desktop. So, like in a multi-session scenario, one session host can host multiple people, and then you have multiple of these session hosts. They're usually running Windows 11 or Windows 10 multi-session image. And so you could have, say, maybe 10 hosts in a host pool, and you have 50 users connecting to those 10 hosts, all distributed across them. Each of those 10 hosts have the exact same image on it, exact same applications, exact same settings, and that's how they're getting their virtual desktop experiences through that. So it's important to make sure that those hosts are stay up to date for security purposes, as well as changes in maintenance over time. So Microsoft provides here a list of different ways that you could achieve that. Microsoft Configuration Manager is one of the ones they mention, MCM. So Configuration Manager is actually part of their endpoint management suite along with Intune. And Configuration Manager used to be System Center Configuration Manager. It was essentially the precursor to Intune, all server deployment, and you used it to manage entire server and laptop and desktop environments. It's still around today. There's many organizations that still use it. School districts are a good example of some that still employ this, and I've had a few projects over the last few years still building configuration manager environments, although a lot of the shift for endpoint management has gone to Intune. And with that said, Intune can be another way, depending on the model that you go with your virtual desktop setup, whether it's Active Directory and hybrid Azure AD joined, or whether it's Azure Active Directory domain services joined, or pure Azure AD joined. That's going to affect the capabilities of some of the tools, like whether you can use Intune or not. A few other things I mentioned here: Windows updates for business, Azure Update Management, Azure Log Analytics. The log analytics, you can check compliance levels, see if they're out of date, up to date, and then you can use Windows updates for business or Azure Update Manager to essentially make sure that those hosts get those Windows updates. But again, that's kind of more limited to the Windows update side. The one I want to really focus on is this last piece mentioned here: deploy a new custom image to session hosts every month for the latest Windows and application updates. You can use an image from the Azure Marketplace or Azure or custom Azure managed image. So the first thing that they mention, and I'm going to drag over a window here to the Azure portal, is essentially use a marketplace image every month and deploy a new image out. So what they're talking about here is that if I were to go into, um, let's see, let's just use um, see all images here. If I would go into the marketplace and to look at my image options, I can see Windows 10, Windows 11, and then my versions here. So for AVD, I'm most likely going to be using this enterprise multi-session to get the most out of AVD. So I could just deploy a new multi-session image on a monthly basis, make sure it's the most up-to-date version. So that's one way to approach it. There are images in here that include the Windows 365 applications too, so you can grab that piece from here as well. So that's one approach. Again, it's very static. You can't really have any additional applications or on it because you're just grabbing the image from the marketplace. So it's just going to be whatever comes on that Windows 11 image, although it will be up to date as far as security Windows update wise. So the other piece that you can do is build a custom managed image. And if I click this link here, think it'll bring it up for me. Yep. So one of the ways is you can create a managed image of your virtual desktops. Let me pull this here. I do have a little diagram So like, for instance, me, if I were building an image, one of the easiest ways to approach this is I could deploy the base multi-session Windows 11 image and deploy it to a virtual machine. I can hop on that virtual machine, install all of my applications onto it, and then I can capture that image to the image gallery. And then I can use that image when I spin up new virtual machines, new hosts in my AVD environment. And then on a monthly basis, um, again, this is more of a manual, rudimentary way to approach all of this, is I can take that custom image, deploy it to a new VM on a monthly basis, run updates, update the application, update Windows, and then recapture that virtual machine to an image and then deploy that image out. There are more automated ways to handle this now, DevOps pipelines, and there's even an image template, an AVD image template that can help with this whole process. And so you can really automate the whole process of updating, spinning up a new image, deploying that image out to the host. But this is probably one of the most complicated pieces when you talk about maintaining an AVD environment. If you have one AVD host, it's not too complicated, but it's still probably the most complicated piece. Is how do I update that image? How do I push out those updates? How do I maintain that for applications as well? And then once you start adding multiple hosts, it becomes even more important. And so this is probably the most recommended approach, is using a custom managed image that you would push out to your virtual desktop hosts. Moving on from there, some Azure limitations for Azure Virtual Desktop. It's just important to note these limitations that are in Azure. So workspaces, that's probably the highest level of the AVD management structure. Workspaces, you're limited to about 1,300 per Azure tenant. Host pools, that's the actual logical grouping of session hosts, those servers that you have in there. So you can have 400 host pools. So that's pools of session hosts. Application groups, that's the logical grouping of users. So when you publish things, like if you publish a virtual desktop out to users, you're going to assign them to an application group that's associated to a host pool. So you can either create an application group that's based around the whole virtual desktop experience, and then assign a group of users to that, or a application group that's for remote apps and assign those to users. And so that you're limited to 500. You can have 500 application groups. Remote app. So remote app within the application group, that you're limited to about 500 remote apps. Role assignments, any Azure Virtual Desktop object, you have about 200 role assignments on the AVD object itself. And then session hosts, this is going to be the actual session hosts that are deployed inside the host pool. So what we were talking about before, the actual server running Windows 10 or Windows 11 multi-session with all of your applications on it. Each of those hosts is limited. You're limited to 10,000 of those individual hosts. If you require more than 500 application groups, you can submit a support ticket via the Azure portal. And some of these numbers sound like a lot, but remember that when you're talking about enterprise level environments, that's at least 1,000 users inside the environment. And so you do, at an enterprise level, start running into these design considerations at these numbers. So the next point here that Microsoft brings up, we recommend that you deploy no more than 5,000 VMs per Azure subscription per region. This recommendation applies to both personal and pooled hosts. Based on Windows Enterprise Single and Multi-Session, most customers use Windows Enterprise Multi-Session, which allows multiple users to sign into each VM. You can increase the resource of the individual session host VM to accommodate more user sessions. So what they're saying here is that you have a limitation of 5,000 VMs per the Azure subscription. If that becomes a problem, and say your AVD environment's growing beyond that, what you can do instead of spinning up additional virtual machines, additional hosts, is just increase the size of your existing host. So say, for instance, you had one host that supported 20 users. Well, just double the size of that session host, and now you can put 40 users on it. So that's a way for you to increase the capacity of your AVD environment without necessarily scaling out more Azure Virtual Desktop session hosts. For automated session host scaling, the limits are around 2,500. So when you're talking about doing scaling, turning on and off on those scaling tools, you're limited to about 2,500 VMs as a part of that. So you have to keep that in mind as you think about the architecture for scaling those. To manage enterprise environments with more than 5,000 VMs per Azure subscription in the same region, you can create multiple Azure subscriptions and a hub and spoke architecture and connect them via virtual network peering. Using one subscription per spoke. You could also deploy VMs in a different region in the same subscription to increase the number of VMs. I do have a video that covers how hub and spoke architecture works or can work in Azure. So what this is saying is you could just put your different groups of AVD hosts into separate Azure subscriptions to get past that 5,000 VMs. So say you maxed out one subscription, you're getting you hit that $5,000 or 5,000 VM limit. You can spin up another Azure subscription and keep building on it. You can connect the two environments through a hub and spoke model with peered virtual networks. Pairing across subscriptions is actually not too much more difficult than when you're pairing VNets inside the same subscription. It just gets a little bit more manual. You do have to grab the resource ID when you create that pairing. But the biggest thing is when you use a hub and spoke architecture is you do have to have some type of NVA. That's a network virtual appliance inside the hub. So that's the middle virtual network. So when you do hub and spoke, you have one middle virtual network and a bunch of spoke virtual networks connected to it. And all of the communication between those virtual networks go through that middle VNet. And so in that case, when you're doing transitive networking, so say you have VNet 1, VNet 2, and VNet 3. Well, VNet 1 and VNet 2 or VNet 1 and VNet 3 may be connected to VNet 2, but they can't talk to each other, even though they're both connected to the same VNet in the middle. It's only when it has some type of routing appliance, a virtual network appliance in there. So that can be an Azure firewall, a Sophos firewall, some type of virtual appliance that can handle routing. And then it's able to route from VNet 3 to VNet 1, VNet 1 to VNet 3. So you can get to all those spokes through that hub VNet and using some user-defined route tables and things like that. But it's not something that's native. When you peer virtual networks together, they can't transitively reach all the other VNets that it's connected to. So that's what it's talking about there. And a way for you to get around that 5,000 VM limitation, use multiple subscriptions. And that's becoming more of a recommended approach to building Azure environments is utilizing Azure subscriptions for more dedicated purposes. So you could have one subscription for Azure Virtual Desktop. You could have another subscription for your storage, another for server infrastructure for particular purposes, and then connect all of those via that hub and spoke model and peering. ARM subscription throttling limits don't allow more than 600 Azure VM reboots per hour via the portal. Their suggestion here is instead of rebooting that massive amount through the Azure portal, you can reboot it from the OS level. So if you have some type of RMM tool or remote tool that can touch all of those servers and reboot it from within the operating system, that gets around that limitation. You're currently deploying up to 132 VMs in a single ARM template. Any more than that, you're just going to need to rerun that ARM template. So if you're using ARM templates to spin up your virtual machines and you're trying to do a large amount of them, just remember that you may need to run that multiple times to get to the number that you need to do. Azure VM session host name prefixes can't exceed 11 characters. That one's pretty self-explanatory. Just consider that in your naming scheme. And then by default, you can deploy up to 800 instances of more resource types in a resource group. Azure Compute doesn't have this limit. And then for more, I post this link in below so you can check out some more additional limitations. Anyway, that's a bit for this video. We're running out of time for the stream. They're limited to about 15 minutes long. So that's it for this session. Stay tuned for more. You can follow me on LinkedIn as well as our YouTube page. See you next time.